Hello, historians. Welcome to On This Day in History, your daily insight into what has happened in the past and how that has influenced the events of the present. On this day, because yesterday makes today and changes what happens tomorrow. A short look at what happened today. So, on this day, the 19th of June, in 1829, Sir Robert Peel introduces the Metropolitan Police Act into Parliament to establish a unified police force for London. This is one of the reasons that in London, police had the nickname Peelers, mainly during the 19th century, the 1800s, but they still got the nickname Bobbies, which still gets thrown around to this very day, because Sir Robert Peel, Robert, Bobby, of course, being short for Robert. So they were Bobby's men, if you will, which became shortened to Bobbies. It is interesting to note with all of the discussion going worldwide about reforms and how policing should be changed for the modern era, that there was no actual structural police force, even in a city as large and diverse as London, until 1829. So policing has indeed been reformed majorly in the past and can be reformed majorly in the future, I think. And hopefully, at this present moment in time, we start seeing those things happening. Also on this day in 1865, Union General, so this means a general for the United States from the North during the Civil War, declares slaves are free in Texas. The date and is now celebrated across the US as Juneteenth as the official end of slavery. Now, we'll get a little bit more into that in a moment. On this day in 1917, the British royal family, which has had strong German ties since George I back in the 1700s, who actually didn't speak English, German was his first language. He was brought over from Hanover to take over the crown as a distant relative when they needed someone to succeed the throne. And of course, he brought his last name with him, which was Saxe-Coburg. So before 1917, the royal family were not known as the Windsors, but the Saxe-Coburgs. Now, in 1917, they were at war with Germany, and this particular last name wasn't doing them any favors. So they officially changed it to the House of Windsor to eliminate that German history. But it is technically, obviously, just a made up name. In 1963, and my Russian here will, of course, be perfect, Valentina Tereshkova was the first woman in space, and she returned to Earth. So in 1963, on this day, the first woman who had been in space was successfully returned to Earth as well. This was quite the milestone, quite the propaganda victory in the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. And in fact, the Soviet Union was pretty much winning the entire space race throughout all of that era, right up until America landed on the moon first, and that basically ended the race. So bad luck, Soviet Union. But at this time in 1963, it looked like the Soviet space program was the superior one. And I had to include this. On this day in 2016, the Cleveland Cavaliers won their first title. They came back against Golden State. They were down 3-1 in a best-of-7 series. They won 3 games straight to win the series 4-3. It had never been done in the NBA Finals before, and it was thanks to a superhuman effort by LeBron James during that series, although he also obviously received support from other stars like Kyrie Irving, Kevin Love, and the rest of his stellar teammates, including an aging Richard Jefferson. But that's okay. We're getting into the NBA here a little bit. I include this because I believe this will be one of those particular moments that will be remembered long after LeBron James retires. There is a famous block in Game 7 of that series, which I have already seen about 10,000 times and will probably see another 10,000 times. It will be part of the LeBron James legacy. But this particular series win will be one of those ones that gets remembered for a long time to come. Anyway, deep dive of the day. What I really want to talk about really is Juneteenth. Now, this is particularly relevant at this time, but it is also gone by many other names like Emancipation Day, Freedom Day, Juneteenth, Independence Day. It's also been known as Jubilee Day, commemorating the end of slavery in the United States, observed annually on June 19th. Now, if you have been paying attention to on this day in history, or you are just indeed quite the keen historian, which of course you are, you would be aware that slavery was supposedly ended by the Emancipation Proclamation 2 years earlier and would be ratified by the 13th Amendment, which, by the way, if you haven't seen it, go to Netflix and watch the documentary 13th. But anyway, ratified by the 13th Amendment in December of 1865. So why on earth June 19th? Well, what had happened with the Emancipation Proclamation was that it had said anyone who is in open rebellion, any slaves who are in states that are in open rebellion to the United States are now free. But the problem with that is President Lincoln was not in command or in charge of those states at the time. He had no authority there. He did not have any military presence. He had no way to enforce that law. It would be like me saying, I formally declare no one's allowed to wear blue on Fridays in this country. Now, I have no authority to do that, so it's just a statement if it cannot be enforced. So while the Emancipation Proclamation was supposed to have freed all these slaves, with no one to actually enforce it, it was of course ignored by the Confederacy, and those people were kept in slavery until the end of the Civil War, which is where this comes in. So after more than 2 years, we end up with this particular news being delivered in Texas. So it was a place called Galveston, June 19th, 1865, when the Union Army, the American Army, turned up and informed them, excuse me, you're not actually supposed to be enslaved. You are free. Slavery has been abolished. And of course, this began a massive celebration, including prayer, feasting, song, and dance. And that would be a tradition that would be followed, especially in Texas, for many years to come. So when they say this was Freedom Day, this was the day that they actually literally, not just on paper, literally stopped being slaves. So it's actually become quite a prominent celebration in the United States, even though it commemorates this seemingly smaller moment where, a police officer came up to enforce the law. Not really a police officer, but a authority figure came up to enforce the law. That ordinarily wouldn't necessarily be what we would call a historical moment. That is just a law being enforced. That should be something that is already happening. But it was the first time this law was enforced. So while Juneteenth doesn't celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation itself, and it doesn't celebrate the 13th Amendment, which made slavery banned in the US Constitution, meaning, as I'm sure you're aware, Americans revere their Constitution, and anything in the Constitution must therefore be followed. So those are two incredibly important events, of course, incredibly important legislation and acts of Congress and the presidency, very, very important. But in terms of their actual effect on the ground, that is why Juneteenth became so important. Because it is one thing to say people are free, and it is one thing not altogether to actually enforce that law and to make sure those people have that freedom. So this is literally the point that people become free, and especially Texas is on the border with Mexico. It is literally the most southern state of the United States. And it is as far away from Washington, D.C. as you could get and as deep into the Confederacy as you could get. And so this was the moment where the laws of the United States had officially reached the deepest parts of the Confederacy and saw that end to that peculiar institution, as it was sadly referred to, of slavery in the United States. So sadly, one of the reasons that Juneteenth is as relevant today as ever is because it actually represents that freedom and justice is delayed for Black people, meaning this law freeing the slaves was passed in 1863, admittedly, not really enforceable, but it wasn't until 1865 that it could actually come into law. And in fact, it wasn't until a Union general with the military supporting him that Black people were actually able to enjoy the freedom the law granted them. Basically, what I'm saying is the law was ignored by white people many times, in fact, until they were forced to follow it. So none of them chose to follow this law. They waited until they were forced. Sadly, in fact, there are some isolated incidents that after Juneteenth, for example, there were still some plantations in Texas that had not freed their slaves, and they deliberately waited until after the harvest to inform their slaves they were free, to use their labor that one last time to get all the work done without having to pay them. And then they said, oh, and by the way, you're free. Bye. See you later. That also happened. So keeping in mind the Civil War had officially ended in April of 1865 with the surrender of Robert E. Lee, they didn't actually know that the Confederacy had ended until June the 19th, Juneteenth, 1865. Again, not the first time that a law that is supposed to protect Black people in America is not actually followed by those who would exploit those particular people. Again, if you're a keen and avid viewer of On This Day in History, you would be aware that this week we talked about the 1968 Supreme Court decision saying there is not allowed to be any sort of disadvantage to Black people in terms of housing. And in 1973, for example, Donald Trump's real estate company was sued by the Justice Department for exactly that 5 years later. So just because something's been passed into law doesn't mean people still don't do it. It's only when they know that they're going to get in trouble or that they know that that law is being enforced that they begin to follow it, which is really sad. Anyway, getting into this. The sad part of Juneteenth is on that first Juneteenth, you can almost picture the idealism that must have absolutely swept through those formerly enslaved people, thinking they had a bright future ahead. But sadly, there would be much resistance to Black freedom, and we would see a wave of lynchings, imprisonment, and Jim Crow laws, basically segregation, where white people were kept separate from Black people, and Black people were not allowed to go into certain places in the South, which is incredibly depressing. And these days, the more modern versions of the legacy of slavery can be seen in mass incarceration, discriminatory housing policies, lack of economic investment. Now, in terms of lack of economic investment, I've gone into this in previous videos, but for example, you can take a look at the Great Depression, which occurred in the 1930s and saw everyone lose their money. So no one had any money. Okay, not literally, but a large section of society had no money. And yet white people were able to recover faster than Black people because when white people went to the bank and applied for loans, they got them. When Black people went to the bank and asked for loans, they did not. There was also, as we talked about, discriminatory housing policies. If you've got the time for a deep dive on that one, look into a policy called redlining. It is incredibly depressing. Anyhow, but at this moment, national attention is focused on police violence, racial profiling incidents. It's clear that progress has been made, but there are indeed many barriers that continue to impede progress. And we're going to talk about that. So newly freed Black people celebrated the first Juneteenth in 1866. So it was in 1865 they were declared free. And 1 year later, they had decided, you know what, we need to commemorate that particular day because that day meant something to us. Because that literally was, as I say, to the actual people that were enslaved, that was the day they became free. Not the day that, an entirely all-white Congress wrote some stuff down on a piece of paper. That had no effect on them whatsoever. It was the day the law was enforced, being June the 19th, Juneteenth, that actually meant something to the people that it was designed to protect. And so that's how it became a holiday, a date to remember, a date to celebrate. Now, Juneteenth is still not taught in most schools, and I say that in terms of American schools, but also internationally. It is not a federal holiday, so it's not a national day of holiday, despite decades of pushing it to be so from activists. And in 1980, Texas became the first state to declare Juneteenth an official holiday, which makes sense because, of course, the holiday began there in Galveston in 1865. Now, taking a closer look at this particular flag, this is the official Juneteenth flag, and it is quite symbolic indeed. It was created by a gentleman, an activist by the name of Ben Haith, who was the founder of the National Juneteenth Celebration Foundation, and this flag was created in 1997. So again, I just want to point this out. While this particular event is not necessarily on the syllabus of most school systems, again, in the United States, but also around the world, this flag was created to commemorate in 1997 when it appeared that most people were forgetting about it. So this has been pushed to be front and center of people's mind and on the agenda for many, many decades. And that was the point of creating this particular foundation, the Juneteenth Celebration Foundation, and indeed creating this flag. Now, the white star in the center of the flag represents Texas, which is also known as the Lone Star State. And the reason for that is because, of course, that is where Juneteenth occurred. That is where Juneteenth began in Galveston in 1865. The bursting around the star is inspired by a nova, which is a term that astronomers use to mean a new star. Now, the Juneteenth flag, this represents the new beginning for African Americans in both in Galveston on the first Juneteenth and throughout all of America. The curve that extends across the width of the flag represents the horizon, a new horizon, the opportunities and promise that lay ahead for Black Americans. And of course, the colors, red, white, and blue, are representative of the American flag, a reminder that slaves and their descendants were and are Americans. Now, just quickly, I need to absolutely stress this. We all know this, hopefully, but I'm just going to repeat it anyway. Black Americans are Americans in the same way that white Americans are Americans, in the same way that Latino Americans are Americans, in the same way that Native Americans are Americans. You are Americans if you are American. It should be that simple. Now, it is unfortunate that they were not, Black Americans were not seen to be this way for many, many years in American history and American politics. And sadly, there are still many people who do not see them this way. The fact of the matter is that 1619 was the year of the first slave ship that brought Africans to the new colonies, to America. And that arrived years before the Mayflower, which is celebrated in many parts of America as the beginnings of colonial settlement in the Northeast and the beginning of the American experiment and all of these particular ideas, when in actual fact, that arrived after the arrival of the first slave ship. So that is very important to note. And also, in actual fact, the percentage of Americans that have one immigrant grandparent, meaning that someone in one of their four grandparents in their family arrived in the United States after 1900 is actually almost 50%. So generally speaking, um, uh, if you are of African American descent, you actually probably have ancestors that have been in America longer than many of the white Americans that are in America. Not that that actually should make a difference, obviously, but I think it often gets ignored or often gets misrepresented, misunderstood. Black Americans are Americans. I cannot stress that enough. Anyhow, um, this is where we will go in terms of why this is particularly relevant and why this is problematic going forward. So, whilst the first Juneteenth was indeed in Texas in 1866, over the years it spread to neighboring states like Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and eventually California as Black Texans moved west. It also appeared in Florida and Alabama in the early 20th century due to migration from Texas. So it did indeed begin as a localized Texas holiday, Texas celebration, but it was spread around America over the years. And indeed, especially at the start of the 20th century, as there was a massive, massive, massive migration, internal migration within the United States of blacks moving out of the South um, for many reasons, including economic opportunities. If they moved to the North, where the factories were, where there were a lot more jobs, a lot more employment. If they moved out into the West, like California, there was a lot of construction jobs because those areas were building a lot of highways, they were building a lot of train tracks, things of this nature. But one of the other major reasons, which might be worth mentioning, that many black people moved away from the South was because of the fact that the KKK and other racist organizations were literally terrorizing them, literally lynching them, and literally murdering them. So many millions of black people moved out of the South for that reason. And of course, why would you choose, if you've got the ability to move, why would you choose to live in a place where black people and white people can't sit in the same restaurant, or black people and white people can't sit on the same train car, when you could move to a place like New York where they do not have those laws? So when this mass migration of black people occurred, this celebration of Juneteenth became a national phenomenon. I want to point out again that this was not taught in schools. And one of the reasons this was not taught in schools is because it did begin and was enshrined and remembered mainly by the Black community. And the Black community were not writing textbooks in the 1870s and 1880s. As a matter of fact, they were not writing textbooks or contributing to textbooks even up to the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, meaning this particular event, which was not considered to be influential to white Americans, was therefore not included in textbooks. And this is something we call whitewashing of history. You can imagine history is something that is chosen. For example, I am talking about Juneteenth because I wanted to. I'm the one who was making this video. If I had chosen to, I could have ignored the significance of this date and talked about something else. I could have talked about, as the deep dive, for example, the royal family changing their last name and not even addressed Juneteenth at all. Now, you can imagine if enough historians who are white are the ones writing these textbooks for a predominantly white audience, many people are going to make that decision to be like, oh, Juneteenth isn't that big a deal. And it becomes seen as a black cultural thing or a black event, something that only matters to black people, and it gets a little bit forgotten. Hence the need for the foundation created by Mr. Haith and the flag to bring awareness to this particular commemoration. And that's one of the reasons it's not necessarily as widely known as it should be. President Donald Trump just recently, in fact, this was published on June 18th. This is what he said about Juneteenth. It was an important event, an important time, but nobody had ever heard of it. Now, this would be part of what I'm talking about in terms of it wasn't taught to him in school. I'm not sure what was taught to him in school, but it wasn't taught to him in school, so it's not important. It doesn't matter. Now, as we can see on the right here, this was the official statement made by Donald Trump's White House on Juneteenth in 2019, a year ago. So here he is in an interview saying nobody's ever heard of it, but he made an official statement of it a year previously. He was apparently unaware of this. Now, the good news is, in the weeks leading up to Juneteenth 2020, a bunch of companies like Twitter and Nike have announced that they have decided to recognize the day as a paid company holiday. So it is on its way to becoming a national holiday. Now, in terms of it becoming more important and more relevant than ever, one last little problem getting into contemporary history here. Donald Trump, in that same interview, has said, "I have made Juneteenth very famous." He didn't. It was famous before that and commemorated before that. Nobody had ever heard of it, he claimed, which is not at all the case, not at all true. Now, one of the reasons he made it very famous is he was planning on holding a rally on Juneteenth in a place called Tulsa, Oklahoma. And amid the backlash in terms of how dare you hold a rally, your rallies are usually filled with Confederate flags and people who don't necessarily respect Black people. It's rude of you to hold a rally on Juneteenth. And so he changed the date of the rally and he made it June 20th instead. Now, I'm not necessarily saying anything here. I'm just going to point this out. But if you need to change the date of your political rally because it would be insulting to the Black community to hold a political rally on June the 19th, that to me suggests that you are quite well aware that what would happen at that rally would also be insulting to the African American community, to the Black community, and therefore you know exactly where you stand on those issues. But that's just me. Now, this is where it gets quite, I don't know if I want to say funny, but shall we say amusing in many ways. So he tried to say that he'd made this thing famous. He told the Wall Street Journal in that interview that a Black Secret Service agent had told him the meaning of Juneteenth after he started facing backlash for this rally. So he got this backlash for the rally. He goes, "What are you talking about?" Went and talked to a Black Secret Service agent who told him. He then realized its importance. And so he moved his rally to the next day and decided to take credit for making the date popular. But he didn't just stop there. In the same interview, where he's bragging about making Juneteenth a big thing and making it famous. He said he polled people in his administration and no one had heard of the date. So apparently no one working for him had also heard of Juneteenth. He interrupted the interview and asked an aide who was present if she had ever heard of Juneteenth. She informed the president that a White House statement commemorating the day had gone out each year of his presidency. So keep that in mind, that he has put out a statement each year saying how much he cares about Juneteenth, and yet here he is in 2020 having issued a statement in 2017, 2018, and 2019, so 3 straight years that he's released a statement, so not made one publicly, not made a public speech obviously, but just a piece of paper that had his name on it, going out saying we care so much about Juneteenth. But when he was told that he'd send out a statement each year, he said, "Oh, really? We put out a statement? The Trump White House put out a statement? Okay, good." So that's, I think it tells us that he had no idea that a statement had gone out in his name. And that means that those statements carry no credibility whatsoever because he wasn't even aware of them. Or alternatively, another explanation was he was completely utterly aware of them, but had forgotten all about them because they don't mean anything to him. He has no care whatsoever about Juneteenth. He doesn't remember it, even though he supposedly sent out these statements 3 straight years, meaning that the words of those statements are completely empty because in each statement he talks about the importance of the date. Now, not that it matters, but just for the record, President Barack Obama also addressed, acknowledged, and put out statements and made speeches every single Juneteenth of his presidency as well. So, Juneteenth has been known for a long time. Juneteenth deserves to be remembered and acknowledged for a long time to come for its actual practical place in history in terms of the day freedom was actually delivered, not just written down on a piece of paper, to Black people in the United States. But it has also been taken up around the world because it is seen as an important date for emancipation and addressing systemic racism everywhere. So this is not just an American event, shall we say. It is of worldwide significance. So with all of that, I hope you have learned something, and I hope that you do not find yourself in a place of ignorance such as Donald Trump did and so often does. Have yourself a very good